else. Emerald, I think we are ready.
Okay, let me start. Okay, we're live.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the February 2020 Wikimedia Research Showcase. I'm Jonathan Morgan with the Wikimedia Research team. Joining us today are two presenters who are going to talk about a theme that I think many people in the movement will find interesting, but maybe have taken for granted for a long time, which is the role of bots in Wikimedia projects. So first today, we'll have Jeff Nickerson from the Stevens Institute of Technology, who's going to be presenting work on autonomous tools and the design of work, focusing on the Wikipedia bot ecosystem, specifically the English Wikipedia bot ecosystem in this case. And followed by Lucy Cafe from the University of Southampton, who is going to be presenting on when humans and machines collaborate, cross-lingual label editing in Wikidata. So we will have, by the end of today, learned something about the role of bots in two very different Wikimedia projects, and I am very excited about this. One thing to note, we're doing a couple of different things slightly differently in response to the feedback that we received from people back in November. Presentations will be a little bit shorter, and we'll have a little more time for Q&A. So I ask you, those of you who are listening out there in real time, either on YouTube or on IRC, don't be shy about posting your questions. We will have plenty of time to get to them. And with that, I think we are ready to move forward. So Jeff, I'll ask you to share your slides and take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me just get this shared. And if I play from start, you should see. Yep. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing with bots, but I'm going to frame it more generally. So I'm going to show you some other things that we've been doing as part of our projects to try to frame why we're studying bots and help in the end in terms of framing some of what we observe about bots and how they might relate to other work activities. I will say that one thing to note is that when I use words like ecology, one of the members of our team, Deborah Gordon, is a biologist at Stanford, and so when we use these terms, we're sometimes using it metaphorically, but in other cases, we're actually being fairly literal about it. Let me go forward and say that our general research question is, how is knowledge production changing as a result of autonomous tools? And what we mean by autonomous tools are tools that, not like hammers where you just use them on the spot, but tools that you send off to do something. And you might send them off for a few hours or a few days. So it's a little bit more like the relationship that you have with an employee than a relationship you have with, say, a hammer. By knowledge production, we mean what you think of knowledge production. We also think of design as being a form of knowledge production. And then we're doing this because we think there's a possibility that we collectively could shape what comes next if we understand a bit better what's actually happening with these tools. Let me talk about a few different kinds of phenomena we've been studying. First, on the top you see a Chilean mountain landscape. And on the bottom, you see a road system through that landscape that was created by an autonomous tool at Ubisoft. What happens is the illustrators now are using tools, and they'll send the tool off for 24 to 48 hours, and it will come back with a road system. And then they'll take a motorcycle, a virtual motorcycle, out on the roads. And if they like it, they're done. But if they don't like it, they'll probably change your parameter. Like they'll say the road should be more curvy, and they'll send the tool off to create another set of roads over 24 or 48 hours. And so we've been interested in this phenomenon of working with a tool over these kind of long time frames. And what we find is that designers say that they're more productive, but they also say that in many cases they miss the experience of actually of actually designing the scenes themselves. Another environment we've been studying is Thingiverse, which is a place where people share designs that can be printed on 3D printers. When we went in to study this, we were most interested in the remixing processes, but we found another phenomenon, which was that a lot of the interesting things, a lot of the exploration of the design space was not happening through individual artifacts, but was happening through meta models. That people were creating models that were parameterized design models that allowed anybody who came into the environment to pull slider bars and change parameters and create, say, instead of one whistle, hundreds of different alternative whistles. And so we became interested in this idea of meta models and the way they explore design space. And that brings us to Wikipedia. And many of you understand, I think, why we like studying aspects of Wikipedia. I will say that one of the things that we find so fascinating about bots in Wikipedia is the bot approval process, because both the bot pages and the bot approval processes have a lot of functional language. It's very hard when you're studying a company to get functional language from inside the company about exactly what their products do, because a lot of that conversation happens around a whiteboard or it comes out of marketing literature. And here, by looking at the approval process, we can get fairly precise functional language about what them studying these kind of phenomena. So, more generally, we would, and that we think is a real enjoy very much studying what happens inside companies like Google and Facebook. But really, most of what happens inside those companies is not accessible to us. And the Wikipedia bot process is accessible to us. And so this brings us to our analysis of the role of bots. And we got the idea of speaking about roles from D.E. Yang's recent work. What she did is she went back into the sociology literature and she realized that roles were very important, but roles were often being hand-coded, and that it would be possible to use natural language processing to extract roles from interactions online. The interactions she analyzed were people's interactions, and we thought that maybe we could look not only at people, but we could look at bots, and we could think about the role of bots. To just kind of frame this a little bit, one of the ways we imagine this space is we think about not only Wikipedia but Wikidata, and we think about humans interacting with Wikidata, but also bots interacting with Wikidata. We think the same thing with Wikipedia, and then we're also interested in this kind of transitional process where data is transferred from Wikidata to Wikipedia and back again. And this will come into play a little bit later when we look at the overall ecology, because in some cases we see that that bots that were active in Wikipedia no longer are necessary if in fact some of what they do becomes part of the processes inside Wikidata. So we think there's a lot of back and forth. We're just beginning to explore this. We think this is a very interesting area of future research. So we think of an ecosystem of bots and humans, and we extract or study this ecosystem by looking first at the bot user pages. We also look at the request for approval, and what I'm going to show you a little bit later is some work that we haven't published yet. I'm interested in your ideas, and also in my sense testing out. This is our first kind of display of some of these ideas. That relate to the way the bots are changing over time, and we're studying this by looking at the sequence of requests for approval. And then the user talk pages are also extremely useful and interesting. And then, of course, the lists of registered bots allows us to more or less take an inventory of what's going on and to look at many different types of bots and many different approval processes that these bots have gone through. And so what we did was we created a taxonomy of bots, and as Jonathan has suggested, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the process for creating the autonomy. It is in our CSCW paper from last November, and we also have we've also open sourced all this code related to creating the taxonomy. So those of you interested can look at it and perhaps build on that code. In short, we go through a process of identification, classification, then we go through a process of looking at how the bots are evolving. That's some of the new work I'm going to talk about. And then in the paper, we spend some time talking about the impacts of bots. In other words, who you interact with first in Wikipedia probably makes a big difference, just the same way who you interact with first in the university makes a big difference. In other words, if the first person you encounter in university is a student or a professor, you might get a different opinion of the university than if the first person you encounter is an administrator or somebody in the police. And so likewise, in online environments, your first experiences can shape your later experiences. We extracted a network of bot functions by looking at the pages in the bot approval processes. We then used community detection to try to essentially cluster these things, and then we went through a process of naming these different roles, and we came up with these roles, which seem anthropomorphic, but it's probably not a coincidence they are, because these bots were created by people, and they're fulfilling institutional functions. In particular, as I mentioned, the protector is in some ways like police, and the advisor is in some ways like a teacher. And so the things and many of these others are like administrators. And so, to use the analogy, almost all institutions will have combinations of these, and Wikimedia certainly has these also. So in the paper, we spent a lot of time talking about what these bots do, but what we didn't do is we didn't look at the trajectory and change of individual bots. And this is the newest work that we're doing. This work has not been published yet, it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, so take it with a grain of salt. But we think we think there's something interesting about the process that the bots go through over time. What we've done is we've taken the space that we were able to build for looking at the functional descriptions, and then we've taken the individual bot approval process steps, and we've mapped them into the space. So what you're about to see is we took suggestBot, and you're seeing an original occurrence of suggestBot, and then you're seeing as you follow the arrows, you're seeing new versions of suggestBot. In this case, what's interesting to us is the second version of suggestBot that had a lot of the language that you would relate to advising and suggesting, and then in some ways the functions after that go back to where they were before, and then cluster around taggers, clerks, and notifier types of roles. Which makes a certain amount of sense, because some of the more recent versions of suggestBot have looked at template building and populating action templates. And so it occurs to us that what sometimes may happen is that over time, many of these different roles may evolve by spending a lot of time on the administrative aspects of the bot once the basic functionality is built out. I'll show you a couple more of these. This is ClueBot, which is really a protector bot. And what's interesting is it spends a lot of the versions have spent time again in these more administrative types of roles. If you think about it, if you've ever visited a police station, a lot of police work is administrative, and I think for good reason. When you're protecting, you document a lot of the things that you protect, and I think that ClueBot is no different from that. And here's a bot that really is mainly administrative, and you can see that it stays pretty much in the space. I'm going to contrast this with the last bot that we've become interested in. This bot is super interesting because this bot absorbed another bot. So Madman retired, and when he retired, his bot's functions were absorbed by this bot. And so you can see this kind of large movement around the space, which I would say is akin to what happens when two companies merge. There's this kind of movement around. There's this consolidation. There's a set of integrations that take place. Now I'm speaking metaphorically. We're hoping that in our analysis we can become less metaphorical and actually give instances of the ways functions are merged together and what this might suggest about what's happening with the bots. Now back to a result we reported in the paper. One of the things we noticed is that the number of bots went down a lot in 2013. We believe the reason for that is that a lot of the interlanguage links moved over from Wikipedia to Wikidata, and so therefore a lot of connector bots were no longer necessary. What's interesting, this came out of a review process in CCW. One of the reviewers said, by the way, you ought to not just look at the number of bots, you ought to look at the number of edits. And when you look at the number of edits, even after the decrease in the number of bots, the number of edits started creeping up again. We think partly because the bots started absorbing other functions. You notice that these things look very nonlinear, and that's in biology. It often is the case that ecologies have these periods of consolidation and then of expansion again, and we think we might be seeing something like that with the Wikipedia bots. Looking at an individual bot, this is DumbBot. We looked at many of these profiles of the individual bots and the relationship between the bot owner and the bot. And what we saw in many cases is something like this, where the bot owner was doing a lot of manual article edits and then built the bot, and the bot subsumed, the bot could do many more edits than the human could do. That's number one observation. Number two observation is that the bot owner then ends up spending a lot of time maintaining the bot. And so this is, we think, maybe akin to some of the things that we're seeing with say, the video game designers. We also see this in chip designers, where the tool itself becomes the focus of work once the tool is built. And then to generalize this a little bit, we think that we're kind of provisionally calling this distancing. There may be better words for it. But in many instances, we're seeing a human who's creating an artifact. It might be a chip, it might be a video game environment, it might be an article. And then the next stage is to work with an autonomous tool. And in that case, the human is playing around with the parameters, but the machine is actually creating the artifact. And then in some environments, we're even seeing these later stage things. So as an example, one can imagine building a bot that built bots that did edits. And so in each of these cases, the kind of creative person involved is becoming more and more removed from the actual artifact. And at least from our conversations with both chip designers and with video game designers, there's a kind of bittersweet feeling about this, as it makes these individuals a lot more productive, but they miss the contact with the artifact. And so, one of the things we wonder about is whether there's a way of starting to bridge these gaps of figuring out new kinds of interfaces. And what I mean by that is that we think that there might be a way of more or less, instead of setting loose one of these processes or one of these bots for days at a time without any kind of intervention at all, it might be possible to somehow have an ambient awareness of what they're doing and then perhaps mold them as they're doing what they're doing. And with that, I will thank you very much. I will stop.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeff. So first, I'll ask Martin Gerlach, research scientist who is monitoring our audience feeds. Do you have any questions coming in from IRC or the YouTube stream yet?
There are no questions yet.
All right. Now we'll turn to the Hangout. Anyone on the call have any questions for Jeff about bots? Okay, well, you asked for it because I have a bunch. I'll go for it.
I don't know. I just want. I have the impression that this drop in bots in 2013 is very related with one specific bot. That is the one that was creating the Cebuano Wikipedia. That also had a lot of activity in the Swedish Wikipedia, I think. So it's basically a bot that was creating stuff from, I don't remember if Wikidata or DVpedia or some external source, but my understanding is just that particular spike is really related with one or two specific bots. Do you have any information about that, or were you aware about this specific bot that now I cannot remember exactly the name?
So we thought, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. What we thought it was is we thought it had to do with a large policy change related to the inter-language link maintenance, which used to happen through a set of connector bots and then became unnecessary as things moved over into Wikidata. But it's quite possible that there were a bunch of things happening then in 2013, that there might have been policy changes and other events happening. I think more generally, what I want to say is that these more or less external things or events in the overall infrastructure and environment might cause certain kinds of drops in population or consolidation, the same way, large-scale weather changes might cause changes in other kinds of ecologies.
Okay, no, that I completely agree. That is for sure, or it's very likely that it's external influence. So it's exogenous. Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the room? Okay, so Jeff, I'm really, so as somebody else who finds ecological metaphors really compelling for Wikipedia, I'd love to dig in a little deeper into this. So, near the end of your talk, you cited kind of a phenomenon, and you mentioned, you kind of name-checked, ecological concept, but then stressed that you were using it metaphorically. I wondered if you, thinking about what does using, other than good, useful metaphors, like what does thinking about, the role of bots in Wikipedia ecologically get us? Does this give us predictive theory? Does this give us testable hypotheses? Like what would we expect if we look at it this way?
So I think it does, and one of the things we've been working with is, so Deborah Gordon's work is with ants. And it turns out that you can predict ant behavior with sets of differential equations. And in particular, the way ants decide things, at least the ants that Deborah Gordon studies, many of these ants make decisions based upon the frequency of interaction with other ants inside the colonies. And in some of the other work we've been doing, and I did cite a paper in the first slide relating to this, we've been looking at these kind of time-based interactions inside Wikipedia, and we've been showing that, yes, indeed, it does seem like Wikipedia editors are very sensitive to timing in the sense that, in a sensible way. Like, so as an example, if a page hasn't been edited in a long time, it's maybe not that attractive to edit it. If it's being edited at a breakneck pace, it might also not be attractive. But in between, there's a sense that there's a community interested in the page, and so people will exert more effort on the page. We think that we can be very precise about this because we can use mechanisms like sets of differential equations to model these kind of nonlinear effects. And we can extrapolate these into an overall ecology to say, hey, while these kinds of bots are perhaps growing, these kinds of bots are declining, these kinds of bots may be reacting to these exogenous types of forces.
That's super fascinating. So thinking about this, this kind of, thinking about the ecologies of humans and non-human actors here. I want to ask questions about Latour, but I'm just not going. We just don't have time to go there. So, but I will ask. So one thing. So I'm a bot operator myself, and I find that like this is a really interesting kind of type of work to do in Wikipedia. I wonder if you can think of, and this is a question I think, Lucy, I'm also interested in hearing your perspective on this. Are there other systems, ecosystems, sets of websites, digital spaces, whatever you want to call them, that have the same kinds of bot and non-bot characteristics as Wikipedia? I mean, I know we're pretty weird, set of communities and projects in a lot of ways, but are there other places where you see bots and non-bots interacting in the kinds of complex ways you do in Wikimedia websites?
So here's I'm not sure. I do think that I think there's something special about the Wikimedia environment, but I also think that it may be a precursor to things that will happen in other environments. One place that we're looking right now is we're looking at computational journalism, because like AP as an example generates a fair amount of stories automatically or semi-automatically. And so we're starting to look and understand how the tools are being used and how it affects kind of their kind of news production. So that's an example of some place it's being used commercially.
That's fascinating. Lucy, do you have any thoughts on this?
So I think, as Jeff was saying, I think there are small places where you can see some human-bot interaction, but I think it lacks generally also the collaborativeness of humans with each other to then add this mix of bots and humans, which is quite interesting. I had one question, Jeff, if you don't mind, which was, sure. Is there an understanding of like whether the bots and the distribution between the roles meet the needs of the community? So can you say, oh, there would be a bigger need of fixers, or could you basically tell bot owners, oh, if you notch your bot a little bit more into that direction? Is there any methodology you thought of that could help with that in any way?
Well, so yeah, yes. I mean, that's another reason why ecologies are kind of interesting, because you can look at an ecology and you can say, there's a niche that hasn't been filled yet. So I think it's possible. This is why we're interested in these, in kind of spatializing what's going on, because we know that there's some kind of gaps in the landscape, right? So the space is not full. And so it may be possible to explore a little bit where the empty spaces are. Now, to the other part of your question, one of the things we're interested in is where are the functions being generated from? Are there kind of exogenous, needs that are being put upon bot developers, or are there kind of these kind of endogenous things where or kind of halfway in between things where an editor says, I'm really sick and tired of doing X, and therefore I'm going to build a bot to do it. And I just noticed because I did that now there's this need for the other thing. So I think there's probably pressures that have to do with outside forces, but they're like when the ClueBot and the vandalism bots are definitely a reaction to pressure. But we also think there's kind of some endogenous things where people are themselves creating their own needs.
That's a really interesting distinction, right? Bots that are kind of serving at like an existing community need versus kind of, I guess, more opportunistic, right? Bots, which are like recognizing a niche that they could exploit, maybe not in a bad way, but like, not an existing like known or established niche. So yeah, I guess this is an area where maybe the ecological metaphor can help us craft research questions. Any other questions from social media or IRC? I didn't see anything. Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff. This was great. And I think that this is a nice, not entirely by accident, a nice transition to Lucy. Lucy, are you ready to take us to another, I guess, just to, misrepresent the ecological metaphor, maybe like another biome I guess, within the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just share my screen. Yeah, that should work. And present. Yeah, so I am particularly fascinated or interested by Wikidata specifically, and what I've been working with a lot is languages in Wikidata. And so my background is knowledge graphs. So knowledge graphs is a form of storing data. And so typically we would say there are 3 ways of creating such knowledge graphs, which are quite important to understand what the implications then for the data, basically. So there are automatically extracted knowledge graphs. So for example, DBpedia, where they extract data from from Wikipedia into DBpedia automatically with tools. There are community-created knowledge graphs. Those are rather rare, where experts, so bio2RDF comes to mind, where experts maintain expert knowledge. And then there are so-called hybrid approaches, which we obviously focus on, where automated tools, so-called bots, and the community together create the knowledge graph, for example, Wikidata. And I usually focus on labels and languages in the knowledge graph, because a lot of applications, so everything that's human-facing, is very dependent on having this human readable data. So question answering system over knowledge graphs, of course. And then also what we worked on before, there was a previous research showcase about this, natural language generation from knowledge graph triples in different languages. And the more languages, obviously, your knowledge graph supports, the more multilingual your applications can be. I know most people listening to that know Wikidata pretty well, but just to give a short wrap up on what do we mean when we talk about natural language representation of entities in a knowledge graph. So the natural language representation is the words that humans can read, and entities in Wikidata specifically have a unique identifier that's language independent, and therefore can be translated to a variety of languages in the knowledge graph. And so previously we worked on just understanding how the language distribution is in Wikidata. It's closely related to Wikipedia as well, but also we have some interesting properties where, for example, Chinese is a widely covered language, widely spoken language, but very rarely covered in Wikidata. And then we have, for example, Dutch, where we have few native speakers, but a lot of data. And we always said, well, this implicates for us that the community has some kind of influence on how the data is created. And so we wanted to understand how the community is editing, and especially this factors of how humans and bots work in the knowledge graph, to understand how this language distribution happened in Wikidata, basically. So we look at 3 different types. So we split the users of Wikidata in 3 different types. Registered editors is anyone with an account and a username. Anonymous editors is people editing under an IP, where we have this limitation that we just assume one IP address equals one user, which is obviously a bit flawed, because maybe multiple people edit under one IP address, or the same person switches IP addresses. And then we have bots, which, as I said, are the automated tools, or the thing we're talking about, the whole research showcase, the automated tools that typically work on repeated tasks. And then we looked into what kind of dimensions we have to measure the editing. We look into general editor activity, so general statistics about the editing and editor count and how many people do what. We look into edit patterns, where we define 2, translation, so where we say people will jump between entities and edit in, sorry, not again, back to, so they will stay on the same entity and translate between multiple languages. And then we have imports, where we have one language and we go across entities. We look into language overlap, just because we thought it would be quite interesting to see if there are correlations between the different languages that people edit. And then generally we wanted to see, based on previous research, whether multilingual editors also have the implication that they are generally more active. So as I said, first we looked into the editor's activity. We looked into all the edits of two labels on Wikidata from October 2012, so the start of the project, until March 2019, just before the deadline of the conference. And so we just made some general statistics. The numbers are very confusing, so I just summarized them very quickly. So we say that about 2% only of all registered editors ever edit a label, but still they're responsible for almost half of all label edits. The largest group of editors are anonymous editors, which is not very surprising. So we have a lot of IP addresses editing, but they only contribute to a very small share of edits on the label specifically. And we have generally, so we had a median of 1 when it comes to the number of languages one editor edits, which means that we have most users that are monolingual, but then some of the editors work on so many languages that they pull the average into a different number. And this indicates for us that already a few active editors can influence the language distribution heavily. And most of the label edits, so over half of them, are made by bots with the smallest number of actual existing editors, which kind of makes sense as well because they are automated, so they edit faster. We looked into Wikipedia, and in Wikipedia, we found a paper from 2014, which states that bots on Wikipedia rarely edit across different language Wikipedia versions. And in Wikidata, that's very different. So we have some bots that interact with up to 250 languages, 247 languages, and then most of the bots are highly multilingual. So again, when we look into the number of languages edited, we see that most of the editors overall are monolingual, and bots are the least monolingual. So there are more bots than any other editor type that will edit across languages. And we have, the bots are also the ones that, so if a bot is multilingual, it's likely that they edit across a lot of languages. And then also, so when we look into how many languages are edited by edits and how many people edit those languages, or how many editors, we can see that the highest divergence is in bots, which means that a few bots influence a lot how much a language will be edited. And that's similar for editors, registered editors, while anonymous editors, because they make so few edits by editor anyway, there's a high overlap between the number of edits for a language and the number of how many people will edit that language. So, and then we looked into the edit patterns. So what I said, we have the idea of translation and import, which we defined based on looking for each editor, how much they jump between languages on the same entity and how much they jump between entities in the same language. And so there is, like, the numbers are relatively low, but they become pretty important on a larger scale, given the number of editors and bots we have in Wikidata. And so with the bots, we can say we have a low number of jumps between languages, but they jump a lot into between the entities, which indicates that they will work on one language across entities and then go to the next language to, across entities. While in registered editors, we have rather translation patterns. So people will stay on one entity and translate it, and then go to the next entity and translate it, especially compared to the number for bots. And then we played around because we had the data already, and it was all prepared in a database, and we were like, yay, now we have some data about languages and editing and people. So we looked into language overlaps. This all looks a bit messy, but basically the idea was that we said we define language families, or we used existing definitions of language families, and each of the nodes is one language family. And we looked into how highly overlapped the connection basically between a person and, so how many people edit in English will edit also in French. The bots, because they are fewer, the language overlaps are just the way we calculated it. The threshold was too high for a lot of them to show up. And for anonymous users, we have a lot of languages that will only be edited by very few people in connection, just because they have so few edits. Generally, English obviously is the most edited. That's why we have the most data in English. And also it's the most edited in combination with another language. So if someone edits French, they're more likely to also edit English than any other language, and the same for all the other languages as well. And then we wanted to see whether there is a correlation between the same language family and people editing it. So am I, because I speak one language, more likely to stay in the same language family or not? There's no significant correlation. While we can see a pattern that it's a bit more likely, there's no actual significant correlation between those things. And then we looked into the activity in multilinguality. So as I said before, there's a definition of the idea that editors that edit across different language Wikipedias are generally more active. And we just wanted to see if that also holds true for Wikidata's user types. And it just doesn't. So because the way Wikidata works is very different how Wikipedia works, so as a Wikipedia editor, to edit across multiple languages seems to be a bit harder, or is a bit harder in general. In Wikidata, it's so easy to edit multiple languages at once, so there just doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between you edit a lot of languages and you're generally very active. So I'll just quickly summarize for the three editor types. So for the registered editors, we see that they're the middle ground between bots and anonymous editors. They're generally fewer numbers, obviously, as the anonymous users, but they do a lot of editing, so they do a lot of the heavy lifting. They seem to somehow edit between the language families more than the other editor types, and they're rather translating. Bots, in comparison, have by far the highest edit count, which is similar to Wikipedia, basically. So they edit a lot. So they are fewer than editors, which also kind of makes sense. And yeah, they edit it. They seem to be heavy multilingual at some point. Anonymous users in general are the largest in numbers, but the lowest in terms of contribution. So they tend to edit across languages once they edit more than once. So we followed, especially as like actionable items, that registered editors, we need to support them more in translation, because that seems to be something they're really good at. So we need translation tool for editors. Bots that contribute to a large number of edits are amazing. So if we want to unskew the numbers of the distribution of languages, investing into multilingual bots seems to be a very good idea. We need to retain anonymous editors, because as we see, once they start editing a bit more, they actually edit across languages. And yeah, so collaboratively, they seem to also, following on the previous talk, basically, where bots have different roles, but also the different editor types inside Wikidata seem to have different roles that support each other. And that's me. Yeah, the work is in collaboration with Camille and Elena, and we worked on this. That's why I have multiple affiliations. We worked on this together in TIB in Hannover. Yeah, thank you very much. That's
Thank you very
it
much.
for me.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So first, going to IRC and YouTube, any questions from the Great Beyond?
So far, nothing from YouTube, nothing from IRC.
Excellent. All right, questions from the room.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Lucy, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm wondering if you have looked into, I think this is a beautiful overview. Have you looked, and I know it's hard, into the topic distribution or anything related to the type of entities that the different actors edit?
So not at all, because basically since we just focus on labels, we don't even have anything related to statements. So we don't even know so all my numbers, I should have emphasized this maybe more, all my numbers are only valid for labels. So there might be a totally different thing happening in editing of statements or references, which is indeed really interesting. But I think it's also interesting, or this would be a nice next step, to even correlate between languages and topics. Let's say it's more likely to edit, Germans edit more likely trains, Italians edit more likely villages. So how can we support multilingual speakers across those topics? That's a very good idea.
Yeah, it would be great. And
Yeah.
I think Isaac has worked on, Isaac, do you want to talk about it? Yes, go ahead. No, I do it. Isaac has worked on a topic model for Wikidata. And so maybe you can share the link, Isaac. You have an API, right? Sorry to. I want to. It's a very nice tool that works pretty well. So I think it might be useful in the future to break down some of these analyses by topic. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds super interesting.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share that. But I actually had a separate question, and thanks, Miriam, for bringing that up.
By the way, I'm just going to interrupt you interrupting each other. This is Isaac Johnson, research scientist, research team. Miriam Reddy, research scientist, research team. Okay, go on.
Thanks, John. Lucy, I was interested in whether you looked at the distribution of like creating new labels versus kind of updating the existing ones, and whether you saw any patterns where, just any patterns in that type of edit activity.
So no, we don't, and I forgot why, because we do have the tag and we do have it in the database, but for some reason we decided not into looking edit versus edition. I'll find out why and let you know. But we didn't. But I think, so the code is somewhere, and I think it's relatively easy. You always say that about your own code, but I think it's relatively easy to set up. So that would actually be quite interesting to just see, because basically, so for the label edits, we use the API tag, WB set label, add label, I think it is. And we use both of them, and we write that information also in the database. For some reason, we didn't look into who adds and edits labels. But yeah, that would be super interesting indeed.
There is a question from the YouTube chat, and it's about the first point on your summary slide. If you have more information or could comment more about the types of support needed for translation.
So this is something that is more not the as scientific, but more the community Lucy speaking. So this was a bit like, I tried to extrapolate what are the kind of things that I think would be good action points for this for the community. And I think that, so there is one tool by Magnus which helps editors. I forgot Terminator. No, one of his tools, which helps people to translate the most used items. And I think this is a very important and interesting step. But also, I think what we started this work with was basically, can we understand what kind of languages people edit, so we can suggest them more what kind of labels they should now create or edit or check. Because I think there's a lot of like hidden language talent in the community, where it would be good to just point them to things where we can say, well, you speak that language, why don't you help us translating it? So there's, for example, the person I worked with, Kemile, is a native speaker in Amharic. So he procrastinated writing his thesis by translating a lot of labels in Wikidata, right? And this would have been super helpful if we had a tool routing him to the things that are most used or most supported. And I think there are a lot of those people in the community already that are willing to do that, but we just have to show them this is the things that we need the most urgent translation for.
Excellent. I had a general question, I think, about is this, and I think I'll start by asking it specifically to you, Lucy, and then perhaps if we have time, I'd like to open it up more to Jeff and then to anyone else. What's the right role for bots in a project like Wikidata? I mean, I think that we take it as a given that bots are, that bots are, part of the ecosystem, and that they're useful, right? They're a useful way, especially when you're trying to populate a knowledge base. But do you have any idea of, like, given Wikidata has been around for 6-7 years now, we've had bots on Wikipedia for, maybe almost 2 decades. What's the right and maybe what's the wrong role for bots in a open knowledge project like ours?
So I think Wikidata is a very interesting one, and that's also one more reason why we started looking into this specifically, because everyone will tell you a lot that Wikidata is edited a lot, and a lot of the edits come from bots. And I think Wikidata specifically, to a large extent, is very dependent on people writing those bots. And I think that it's so if Wikidata understands itself as a source of general knowledge about the world, or a central storage of general knowledge about the world, I think bots are elementary to collecting this knowledge and bringing it together, because no one wants to read out all those CSV tables and edit them and create them and import them into Wikidata. I think bots in this case are super important and super interesting. And I think we tend to forget also that, I mean, you as a bot creator will know that more than anyone, that it's actually people writing those bots. They're not out of nowhere. So it's as much a community activity as me by myself writing and editing and translating labels. So I think this is really important. And I think that's why this kind of work to me is really interesting, especially also what Jeff is working on, the whole question of what roles do bots already have, and how can we make them fit to the community, or how can we support those bot creators, because they are part of the community as well. I hope that answers your question.
Sure, but I mean, before I throw it over to Jeff, do you have any particular ideas about things that we should do, like things that we should do to help support like a vibrant human bot ecosystem in Wikidata or across the projects?
I think generally the easier we make it for people to create bots, the better. So the easier it is for someone speaking a language that is not as represented, which Chinese, for example, if we make it very easy for people to write those bots and import language knowledge into the knowledge graph, I think that's a very good way of going with that, because the community usually regulates itself somehow magically. So. Which is super interesting, I guess.
No, that's great. No, I agree. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to add about the proper role of bots, the future of bots, opportunities, things you want to highlight? I did mute you before, and I think you are still muted. So you might want to unmute on your phone, if that's possible. If that is difficult, I apologize.
Turn on the microphone.
Just
that's
hang up
not
your
good.
phone. Hang up your phone. I think actually your audio was working on your computer. So if you hang up the phone now, then we might be able, and then unmute yourself on your computer, we might be able to hear and see you through the same device. Can't hear you yet, though. Maybe turn off. We were having trouble with Jeff's audio before we started, and the phone was an interim solution. But it seems as though we may be having new trouble. which is ultimately all my fault, and I apologize.
Okay, let me try this.
Yes.
This will work.
Perfect.
So I think that there might be a need to think about how to monitor the bots, right? So you might need to build bots that monitor the bots, and that's a kind of a complicated thing, but it may be necessary given the way you're going to have to scale, or the way naturally things are going to scale. Does that make sense?
I mean, it sounds incredibly exciting. So can you talk a little more about like why we would need bots to watch bots? Like what's the advantage of that, and what are the use cases?
So the reason for it is just the speed with which bots can disrupt, right? So I'll give you an analogy. Is in high frequency trading right now, the SEC and others have had to build tools that monitor what the automated trading bots are doing, because they can't intervene by hand anymore in what the bots are doing. So they have to build tools that are watching what's going on and give them signals that things have gone awry. So I think that that's something that's going to be, as bots put more and more data into Wikidata, I think it may be important to build out kind of this infrastructure where you have independent bots that are monitoring the bots that are inserting the data, so that you can catch things before they get out of hand.
That's interesting. I was thinking about a mistake that I made a couple of years ago with my bot, where it started posting hundreds of messages to article space rather than user space, because I had forgotten to uncomment a line of code. I mean, a human noticed this fairly quickly, but I imagine that a bot that was, that had, I guess, had a model for what my bot's normal behavior was in general, might have been able to halt the bot substantially quicker, because it turns out my bot has, if my bot is editing main space, that's something is wrong, right? Like by default, because my bot never edits main space. So yeah, no, I'm starting to see how could have saved myself some shame and some manual labor a while back with this approach. That makes sense. Lucy, do you have any thoughts about this? Just curious.
No, I think it sounds really interesting. I just like the idea of like the community growing more and more into this ecosystem of bots collaborating. So my next paper would be not how humans and bots collaborate, but like how bots and bots collaborate, which I think kind of makes sense in the larger scheme, right? So I think that's where a lot of it is moving to. And in Wikipedia, we're just limited to the fact that there needs to be context to what people write. But in Wikidata, I can imagine that would be an amazing thing to have something that just checks that bots don't like completely fall out of line. Which then also becomes interesting with the question of bot requests. So can we then also control that people only do what they requested their bot to do? And is that necessary in the first place? Do we want that? Do we want a bot to only do what it was supposed to, what was the community agreed on that it would do? Or do we want to leave it free running?
Yeah, so there's this interesting possibility of, so I know that Aaron Halfaker, research scientist and head of the scoring platform team, he's built the ORS APIs, which provide models for detecting vandalism. He's also building a system called Jade, which allows people to basically take any edit, which could be a revert made by a bot, and rescore it, annotate it, say whether it was good or not. I suppose in this context, if we had a sufficient number of people who were going through and say evaluating different edits, and we had an anti-vandal bot working in that ecosystem, you might see a case for for kind of interactive learning approach, right? Where the bot is actively training itself based on explicit or implicit input from individuals who are scoring, providing new ground truth, essentially, that's relevant to the bot's task. I could see that being really exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of a generative adversarial network of bots.
All right, I think we have the title for your next paper, possibly in collaboration with Lucy as well. Any other questions before we stop for today? In the room or out on IRC or YouTube? Okay, well, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you both, our speakers today, Jeff Nickerson from Stevens Institute of Technology and Lucy Cafe from University of Southampton. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody, wherever you are. Thank you, Jana Layton, for coordinating, and Emerald Ross for AV, and Martin for personing the IRC and YouTube channels. So happy February, everybody. We will see you back in March.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. That was great. Man, thanks a lot, Jeff.
Okay, thanks. Bye.